But I really don't have any regrets. I really don't. I've lived exactly how I've wanted to. I've tried my hardest every single time. I didn't win the matches that maybe I should have always won, but I really gave it my all. So that for me is enough.
Hello everybody, welcome back to The Body Serve. I'm Jonathan.
I'm James.
US Open preview, hey!
Thought it was just going to be a cute draw preview, some minor controversies.
No,
but...
I mean, we're just going to talk about the Cincy finals, that's it. Nothing else happened this past week.
Number one player in the world, Jannik Sinner, apparently tested positive twice for a banned substance back in March. Nobody knew about it. Nearly nobody in the world knew about it. Mm-hmm. No whispers, no leaks, no journalists even discussing it as a rumor. But we found out just this past week.
But why would they?
Why
discuss
would they?
It as a rumor? Like, he didn't miss time. It wasn't like is this a silent ban thing?
Because it's massive news, and the fact that it remained a complete secret for 5 months is actually impressive, but surprising.
I think it shows that for this player, at least, the system worked in keeping the secret.
It worked for him.
I'm just saying, you made it seem like the journalists were derelict in their duties.
No,
that's what I'm just saying. That's what it sounded like to me. That's
anyway, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with Mr. Sinner?
No, it's very clear, the agenda. We finished Cincinnati and then keep it going. There's a clear segue from talking about Sinner winning Cincy to then talking about the drugs.
So you're going to make the folks click to the appropriate timestamp so they can skip all this.
I understand you're very eager to talk about your drugs. So many people tagged you on the internet this past week.
They know I'm into it. I do want to reiterate that I'm not an expert in any way. It's just a pet interest of mine. Mm-hmm. And I do make sure I do my research before talking about it, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not a drugs expert. It's just something that I like to talk about. Aryna
Sabalenka is your Cincy champion, breezing by Iga Świątek in the semifinals 6-3, 6-3, before taking out Jessie Pegula in the final in straight sets.
That's Jessie Pegula in the finals of both Toronto and Cincinnati. She won Toronto, reached the final in Ohio at the other Billionaires tournament. Mm-hmm. Sabalenka, yes, won 6-3, 6-3, but it did take almost 2 hours and 10 match points to put away the world number one.
We'll get more into it later, but I just see Sabalenka as having the highest baseline on hard courts of any player on tour.
On quicker hard courts.
Sure.
Because Iga is the Indian Wells champ, I think Doha champ, but apparently Cincinnati was playing very, very fast. They showed that whatever metric they used to measure the court speed, it was significantly faster than it was last year. And then we hear at the US Open that, well, the courts are fast, but not as fast as Cincinnati, and I don't know. Give me the measurement.
My point was, Sabalenka is the player on these courts who will have the least shocking results up until like a semi, or she will get where she needs to go.
Yes.
And she will not be susceptible to an upset because she's just in her bag on the surface in the early rounds.
And I believe that this sets her up to be a clear favorite for the US Open title, probably the clear favorite.
Well, wonderful.
Iga was talking to Sky Sports, and she's mentioned this a few times, that she feels that the schedule is too long. And she said, I think we have too many tournaments in the season. We deserve to rest a little more. Maybe people are going to hate me for that. And you could tell she was being cautious as she talked about this, because she knows the response she's going to get. Either that you're entitled, or all you do is complain, or, hey, you played an exhibition in the fall. How dare you complain about the schedule? The point is, Iga is right. Tennis does not have an off-season.
And then noted nice guy, Yevgeny Kafelnikov, he tweets, quote, "Is someone pushing you to play? All you frickin' do is complain. I'll tell you what you deserve. You deserve to get paid a lot less than you do now. How about that?" Why? Why should she get paid much less than she does now? And why is this any of your business?
Like, can you calm down with the exclamation points? What has gotten into you?
He was notorious for playing every week, all day, all year, and chasing money when he was on tour. I remember that distinctly. And he was just never great enough to make that much money when he played.
Legally, you mean?
I'm trying to say, while he won the Australian Open and the French Open, reached as high as world number 1 in the rankings, made over $23 million in his career, it must hurt him that Iga can do that in 2 years. Like, like, when you're misogynistically inclined, these are the types of things that go through your head. Like, what other reason is there for this? Sit down.
Right. Why should she earn less? The whole thing was unhinged. And then Daria Kasatkina got involved and shared a screenshot of their relative career earnings. Iga has out-earned Yevgeny and said, I guess this is why you're mad. Hit him again. Dasha has been very online lately.
And I'm here for it as opposed to somebody else who is online a lot in tennis.
Oh, there are a few of them. Many of us, as we get older, get less online.
I want to be as least online as possible to still have this be a viable show.
Right. Only the required level of onlineness. Jannik Sinner, as you mentioned, won the Cincinnati title. At the time, we had no idea that he was also attending a Zoom hearing with the independent tribunal to close off this doping violation.
Apparently
case.
It went all day. It was like 5-6 hours.
Yeah, it was during the tournament. He beat Francis Tiafoe in the final. That is a huge result for Francis because the results have not been resulting lately for him.
Well, he said at the start of the summer hardcourt swing that he was going to have a hot girl summer with the results, and he's backed it up so far.
And high-quality wins against Lehechka, Musetti. There's a walkover against Hurkacz, and then in the semifinal beat Rune in a third set tiebreak. I actually think he played pretty well in the final, but Jannik was simply too good. Like, just too steady off the baseline.
Francis had, I think, 3 break points in that first set, and was also holding his serve much more easy than Jannik. It's just that he was unable to convert those break points, and then when you get into the tiebreak, loses it 7-4, and then the tide could not be turned after that.
Francis and Jannik had that, I don't know if I'd say it was a run-in, but a few years ago in Vienna, Francis was really demonstrative, as he sometimes can be, right? He was interacting with the crowd, and he was acting in a way that you could tell Jannik really, really didn't like. And he made comments about it afterward. And since then, I wasn't really sure what their relationship was, if anything. Like, it always felt to me that Jannik didn't really know how to vibe with Francis.
It seems like there's a lot more you want to say, but you shan't.
Well, I don't know these guys, right? So I kind of assumed that Jannik just didn't like him after that incident in Vienna.
Wasn't there also the whole bit where Jannik was doing his own version of hyping up the crowd in retaliation? That was well out of character for him up until that point.
Yes. And then I saw a few people say that Jannik took inspiration from that match and learned how to engage the crowd more. And I don't really get that. I guess
is this the type of thing where in 2020 you look back at George Bush's presidency and his record has been
expunged,
whitewashed, like sanitized? You come up with some narrative as opposed to what actually happened. Yeah. But anyway, Francis walked up behind Jannik as he was taking photos and flipped him off. I was like, Francis, wow, your head, as you say, really tech you. What were you thinking? And of course that set people off. Oh, yeah. There he goes again, unable to behave, uncouth, disgusting. I mean, this is in keeping with everything we've seen from Francis.
Yes. It was mischievous. The way he did it, it was like puckish, you know?
That's what I'm saying. He takes the piss. It's just that if you're willing to think the worst of him, you look at that as an aggressive thing. And I'm willing to bet it wasn't.
No. And the way I saw it was, wow, something just came into your head and you decided to go with it. You didn't think about it for a second.
I mean, was it rude when Robredo flipped Murray the finger at net? You know, I mean, these things can happen. It just seems like the messenger being Francis with this stuff is just not well received. And the reasons why that can be vast or very narrow. Mm-hmm. I think it's very narrow, personally.
But the result sets Francis up nicely for the US Open. He's done well here the past few years. Last year he lost to Shelton, and this year he may have to face Shelton in the third round.
Mm-hmm. I guess we won't go into the US Open preview now. You can have your drugs.
World number 1, Jannik Sinner, tested positive for the banned substance clostebol twice, on March 10th and March 18th. He successfully appealed his provisional suspension twice, and nobody knew about this until this past week, August 20th, when he was officially cleared. And it was determined that he had no fault or negligence. That is a very high bar. That's different from no significant fault or negligence.
Who had no significant fault or negligence?
That was Simona Halep, Maria Sharapova. That basically means they were negligent in some way. And we'll get into the comparisons because there have been a lot of kind of casual comparisons to other tennis doping cases. And there are some similarities, but it's important to take all of these on a case-by-case basis.
So by the letter of the law, had Jannik taken to social media and said, free at last, I am completely exonerated, 100% innocent, based on the ruling the way it was written, would he be justified in ways that Simona wasn't?
More so, more justified, yes. The conclusion is that, yes, he did commit an anti-doping rule violation. By virtue of having this drug in his system, you've committed a violation. Mm-hmm. However, he was found to have no fault or negligence in how the drug got into his system. All of his ranking points and prize money during Indian Wells are forfeited because the rule violation was committed during Indian Wells from an in-competition test. However, if retroactively they change the rankings, Djokovic would have one additional week at number 1. The ATP has decided not to do that, which is a very interesting choice.
Well, get on it, Pavi. Use your powers for good for once.
Clostebol is an anabolic steroid, a pretty weak one, that is sometimes used in topical sprays or ointments, and it's found mostly in Italy, but in some other countries, in Brazil, for example. The drug was once part of broader doping programs in East Germany, like in the 80s. Now it's commonly found in Italian pharmacies. You can obtain it without a prescription. The package has a big warning on it. A big circle with the word doping in the middle with an X.
And the reason why that warning is on the packaging is because it's so widespread in Italy. Meaning so many Italian athletes across multiple sports have been testing positive for this substance and facing bans. And so the producers of that drug now have to put this on the packaging.
Over 50% of the clostebol cases across sports are thought to have originated in Italy.
And that's really only because, well, mostly because Italy and I think Brazil is the other country where it's available over the counter without a prescription.
Right.
And so naturally, if you have a substance that you can just walk into a store and get only in those two places or mostly in those two places, and you can't do that in the US, Canada, England, you're going to get players testing from those countries as opposed to US, Canada, and England. I just make that distinction because I think it helps to kind of undercut this idea that there's maybe this mass drug doping clostebol ring in Italy.
Right.
You know?
It doesn't necessarily mean that all these people are more guilty than
Yeah.
players in other countries. It's just that this drug is readily available and treating other minor injuries, right?
In a similar way, you had the majority of meldonium positive tests coming out of Russia because it was available in Russia,
Right.
as opposed to other countries.
Now, in the past, athletes have exploited that availability to either mask or sort of divert attention from other more serious doping. And I'm not trying to imply that's what's happening here, but that is something that is part of doping programs historically. So the product is called trophodermin. Careful. Just be careful if you encounter trophodermin and you're a professional athlete. A quick timeline here. April 4th and 5th was the first provisional suspension. This was based on the test from March 10th. The Sinner team quickly responded with evidence, and the provisional suspension was revoked. Therefore, it was not made public.
And the timing of it coincided that he didn't have to be conspicuously absent from events that he would normally have been at.
Right.
People are looking back on it and saying, well, maybe this is why he didn't want to play the Olympics.
Then, from April 17th to 20th is the second provisional suspension. That's based on the positive test from March 18th. And again, Sinner made an urgent application, and the suspension was lifted. Following that, the Tennis Integrity Agency issues a notice of charge on May 30th, and this is during Roland Garros. The Sinner team responds to this notice of charge on June 10th. The parties agree to expedite this matter. And finally, August 15th, during the Cincinnati tournament, is when we have the hearing. At this point, this is when the independent tribunal is convened. Sinner logs on to Zoom while he's playing the tournament. And what needs to happen here is that there must be a standard of comfortably satisfied that the ITIA has established each of the elements of the rule violations. Both of these violations are strict liability offenses, meaning that the agency does not need to prove where the substance came from. The burden of proof here is on the player if he wants to be completely exonerated. If the player establishes that the rule violation was not intentional, the starting point for the period of ineligibility is 2 years, with either reductions or having the suspension completely wiped. And that's what happened here. Jannik's case. What did he say happened?
Allegedly, his fitness coach Umberto Ferrara bought the medical spray trophodermin to be used for cuts, which seems to be a common use for this thing. You get a cut,
Right.
it helps, the spray helps it to heal. It's available in Italy without a prescription, and it contains clostebol. More than 50% of doping cases involving clostebol happen in Italy. That we know, we've covered that. So we know that the trophodermin is in the team. You know, we've always talked about Jannik seemingly having a very professional outfit. You know, one of the most professional teams on tour. This team consisted of his fitness coach, and then also he had a physiotherapist. Now, that physiotherapist, Giacomo Naldi, cut his finger in Indian Wells. Ben Rothenberg has gone back and studied the tapes, and you can see that that part of the story checks out because Naldi had his finger taped on multiple different days. Ferrara allegedly gave Naldi the trophodermin for his cut. Naldi did not check the ingredients. Naldi then gave Sinner full body massages every day from March 5th to 13th. He did not wear gloves and had removed his bandage. Now, this is something I don't know if I needed to know, but
these are the things that come out.
Added information in the evidence. Sinner has psoriasiform dermatitis on both his feet and back. He had small cuts and lesions on his body. And when massaged by Naldi with a cut on his finger that had been treated with clostebol, this is where the pasta got infected.
Exactly. This is the smoking tortellini, if you will. The finger with this spray has now touched the player who has apparently open lesions. Now, you know, this is not embarrassing, right? To have a skin condition. We're not making fun in any way. What is weird is how careless this is, that a physio would touch a player who has lesions on their body and not think about the things that you've put on your hands before doing so.
But skip that part of it. It's cut to cut. That's gross, period.
Right.
It's like basic cut hygiene. Basic stuff, right?
So let's say, we accept this story as 100% truth. It seems incredibly careless.
According to Darren Cahill, he says that Jannik knew of the cut and asked Naldi multiple times, did you take anything, or what did you take, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And that's at the crux of his exoneration here.
The adverse analytical finding, the AAF, is 112 picograms per milliliter. That's the concentration that was found in the sample. Now, we'll talk about this a bit later, but the Sinner team did a genius stroke of public relations here in talking about this concentration in a way that scientists don't. They said less than 1/billionth of a gram, and it frames the discussion in a totally different way.
Because when we see that on social media and people talking about it, it becomes, well, how could that possibly have affected any performance? Like, this clearly is incidental, accidental, inadvertent.
But if you're not a scientist, do you or do I have any idea what that number means? Do we have any idea what a normal concentration would look like, or what an insignificant concentration would look like? No, we have zero frame of reference because we don't know the normal range.
It's basic chemistry, like when you're doing experiments, to know...
What is a range that could indicate performance enhancement? Is there a trend, right? Is this kind of the tail end of the drug metabolizing out of someone's system? Those are all questions we don't know the answer to.
Right. Could there have been a higher concentration of this drug in the system had they been tested 3 days prior?
Right. And these things tend to metabolize quickly. A picogram, just so you know, I did have to look it up as well. It is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. A study in the journal Drug Testing and Analysis showed that transdermal contamination is possible. So the way that the clostebol made it from the physio's hand to Jannik's skin, that is possible. And they even showed that short contact, brief contact can create positive tests in urine tests.
I like when the English language used in science makes deductive sense. Transdermal makes perfect sense.
Right.
As opposed to...
as opposed to you could suspend a suspension. This was driving me crazy a few minutes ago.
Oh,
anyway.
Holy.
I hope this is not boring because I love this stuff. So what is required to tell us that Sinner or any player has no fault or negligence? There are 4 main points.
First, that the player did not know or suspect that they used or were administered the prohibited substance. Second, the player could not reasonably have known or suspected that they used or were administered the prohibited substance. Third, the player upheld their duty of utmost caution. And lastly, the player can establish how the substance entered their system. Now, in this case, they offered immediately how it entered into a system. They didn't have to go and trace the cattle, the stock, in Brazil.
Right. This is perhaps the most important piece of the case, that you can establish immediately how you believe that you tested positive. Where did the substance come from? Because if you can't convince them, within a day or two, your suspension is now public.
The player upheld their duty of utmost caution. This is where Jannik asking Naldi multiple times, did you use anything? This is all being relayed by first-person account from Jannik, sure, but also it's he said, she said, do I trust you? This is not something that can be scientifically proven.
Right.
But he's offering that he did his job in trying to prevent this situation from happening. He made sure his team was up to date on drug testing protocols, what should or should not be part of their medical setup, and that in this massage scenario, once he saw that there was a cut, he asked, hey, what have you been taking? Is everything clean and clear and under control in this situation? And because of that,
Exactly. They determined that the player discharged his responsibilities and that the failure was really on the team. Now, you may remember from the Halep case that a player is responsible for the failures of their team, but there's a precedent in the Sharapova case, which was cited by the Sinner legal team in their case, that if the player has shown utmost caution and the team still messes up, the player can be cleared. So in this case, he hired people who were experienced. The fitness coach Ferrara has a degree in pharmacology. He ensured that they were educated on anti-doping, as you said, and he was cautious, asking Naldi, like, are you using anything on your cut? How's your cut? Whatever. He had no knowledge that this Clostebol or the Trophodermin spray was even in the vicinity. And the tribunal accepted that he also couldn't reasonably have known it was. So, according to them, he hit all the points.
A key difference here with Halep is that she waited so long to offer the source of the contamination and then also to blame somebody.
Mm-hmm. And I said this when we covered Simona's case. She should have blamed everybody and anybody from the jump because it works. Even if it's not the right thing to do, even if you're not telling the truth, often it works. But the problem is Simona, her suspension didn't get lifted because she wasn't able to provide evidence that was convincing to them. And she didn't even mention this potentially contaminated supplement at the first interview. So that's the key difference there. Now, I'm not saying anything about why Simona's case took so long or whether it was fair to her. I'm just saying at the outset, that's why the suspension wasn't lifted. Now, let's be clear. Few of us, very few of us, are qualified to judge the merits of the case. Certainly not us. Us too. Right? And most of us choose to either believe the evidence or not, based on whatever we bring to the table. A lot of times that's, do you like the player? Do you trust the player? Do they have a good reputation? Does the case feel convincing to you as a layperson? And again, you and I are not qualified to make that judgment. I think what we are qualified to do is demand that there is transparency in the process and that the process is, but also looks fair to everybody.
You have here highlighted on the agenda that the secrecy of it invites people to cast doubt, whereas I'm inclined to lean toward the secrecy being something that should be on the side of the player. Like, this is their reputation.
Right, as the defendant, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Why should this be public knowledge for all this speculation to happen while I'm going through the process and also showing up at events trying to play, if I'm innocent?
I totally understand that.
Because we will never be able to tell if somebody's truly innocent or not. We will never know.
No.
We will never know.
Right. You're right.
So I think this is fair. The issue then becomes, how fair is the process if everybody from the world number 1 to the world 200 doesn't have the same resources to fight the battle in the same way? Mm-hmm. I think that, more than innocence or guilt, is the biggest issue and biggest takeaway from this story. And with the secrecy bit, we got a nugget from Blair Henley. She tweeted that in 2016, the ITF pledged that it would publicly announce, quote, adverse findings if a player were provisionally suspended. However, if a player doesn't accept the suspension, it wouldn't be made public until a resolution was reached, which is what happened in this case.
Right. This was 2016 when the ITF still administered anti-doping. Now it's ITIA, and there's this document called the Tennis Anti-Doping Program, which you can freely download. Article 8.6 in the TADP is what references this. Like, when are these findings made public? There are a lot of outs. And let me tell you, I have read this paragraph probably 10 to 15 times, and I'm still not sure I fully understand what it's saying. The point is, I believe that they were acting within the rules by not publicizing the Sinner case because the suspension, at least, had reached a resolution. The provisional suspensions. Because they were challenged and then they were thrown out. those are the rules, fine. But do the rules make sense? Are they encouraging transparency and trust in the process? And I get all of your reservations, but I've weighed them, and I don't think that they create trust across the board. I think the fact that this is the number one player, well, that was just bad luck for the tennis powers that be, I guess. But the number one player gets to completely adjudicate his case behind closed doors, and nobody knows about it until it's totally done. He is wealthy enough. He has a team led by Darren Cahill. He could call up, Howard Jacobs would take his call any day. He has very powerful sponsors as well. Like, he has everything at his disposal, whereas someone like Tara Moore does not, right? She's not able to mount a case within several days before her provisional suspension is announced to the world.
And so she has all this time off tour, only to then be acquitted, and then have to rebuild her career via GoFundMe.
And it's not even over. So it took 19 months for her case to wind its way through the courts. And now the ITIA has appealed the independent tribunal's decision to clear her. The case will now go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And again, like all the disclaimers that this is a totally different case. She tested positive for nandrolone and boldenone, similar to Robert Farah, right, who they determined that it was in the beef. And again, this was a test in Bogota, Colombia. And she was able to show, at least to the independent tribunal, that, yeah, it was a contamination case. But what I'm saying, we heard from a lot of players, some in bad faith, some just concerned. Players have a right to know that the process is fair, right? Procedural fairness is important. And they also have a right to know that the process is meted out equitably to everyone.
Mm-hmm. What we're getting is potato-in-chief Nick Kyrgios calling people potatoes all over the place, spreading misinformation on the internet, not doing the research, not doing the responsible thing without spouting off about this should be a 2-year suspension, blah, 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 saying this is unfair, everybody isn't treated the same. And while that is true, how you got there was wrong, and how you're going about it is wrong.
And also, it's just like, who trusts you at this point? But Denis Shapovalov said something like that there were different standards for different players, and I don't really think that any of these are leveled against Jannik Sinner personally. I think it's frustration with the system overall. And I think the reactions are fair. I really do. The fact that players are speaking publicly about this, I think it needs to be understood as them looking at the system where they feel like they don't have power and saying, well, this needs to be fair. Now, the gigantic caveat here is that last time when we talked about the Halep case, I was marveling at how tennis players were so openly hostile and disdainful to their anti-doping system. That is true, and it's different than most other sports, in my experience. But I also think they do have a right to know that top players will be treated the same as everybody else.
Or vice versa.
Well, exactly.
The inverse of that, more importantly.
Yeah. Some questions that are still going to be outstanding, even though this case has been resolved.
We mentioned the whole propaganda, if you will, of 1/1000th of a gram.
Yes.
Is this as insignificant as it sounds? And you've noted here that no, it's common to measure PEDs in nanograms per milliliter, which is billionth per milliliter. Skier Teresa Johaug, who was suspended for 18 months for a closterball, had 13 nanograms per milliliter. Sinner had 112 picograms, or 0.112 nanograms. So his is a fraction of what she tested positive for.
Mm-hmm. Per milliliter, though.
Yeah.
Right? They sort of removed the concentration piece of it. So when you think about it, 1/1000th of a gram everywhere. No, it's actually in a small volume of liquid. That's the only thing that they can measure here.
What do we make of Darren Cahill as a messenger in this case, given his proximity to and outspokenness of Halep in her case? Once this news broke, I believe it was the very same day Chris McKendry got Darren to sit down with ESPN for a 10 to 12 minute interview, and it was something to watch, truly, for many reasons that could be taught in sport sociology classes as to how conflicts of interest are problematic in sport and the many ways that they exist, specifically in this case, tennis.
And teach it in a journalism class too.
Interdisciplinary.
Right. This is a commentator who has worked for ESPN for many, many years, on and off. We all know his voice because he's on our TVs.
He's now hedged his reputation twice to vouch for the reputations of two players that they couldn't have possibly done this because of their character. Then we consider his conflicts of interest as coach and commentator. At what point does his word and reputation get diluted? I'm not saying you can't believe him. I'm saying that because of his conflicts of interest, when you say stuff like this now twice, how much weight does your word still carry?
I imagine that when he found out about Jannik's positive test, he must have been like, oh, fuck. Because they were still dealing with the fallout of the Halep situation, where he was very publicly acting as a character witness for her. And now his own player has tested positive for a banned substance. Even if they can explain very clearly where it came from, and the tribunal accepts that, this is now two players he's closely associated with who have tested positive. I was surprised how vocal he was about Simona, because at a certain point in time, her case did not look good. Right? Eventually, the suspension was reduced to 9 months.
Okay. Also, he was not her coach at the time when this happened to Simona.
Patrick was her coach.
Hence why you say closely associated, because people still see the two of them as being heavily intertwined, and that hasn't been reduced due squarely to how Darren has stood by his woman through this whole scenario.
Right, like he chose to insert himself.
Yeah.
He actually didn't have to.
Was a testifying witness.
I'm glad that Chris McKendry asked him about what's been perceived as the secrecy around the Sinner case. He also conceded that wealth and fame provides you a lot of privilege in how you're able to fight these cases. But I have to go back to the fact that you have platformed a coach of the number one player who has also worked for you for many, many years. And even if you disclose that fact, this person has a really privileged position in being able to articulate their case.
Chris
right?
did disclose that at the start of that interview.
Overall, fascinating, right? This is a great opportunity to get a coach talking about a resolved doping case so openly and so articulately. But I have to wonder, Darren is someone who many of us, I think, have perceived as a stand-up guy. We don't know him, of course, but he seems like
above board, legit. All the pitfalls of why you wouldn't like somebody in tennis, he's not that.
Right. And he has staked his reputation on the innocence of these two players.
How lucky for Jannik Sinner to have his coach with the foregrounding of being an ESPN commentator for so long, of being a trusted voice, of being somebody who has access, of somebody who has face, name, and voice recognition by the general public, to immediately be able to go out on TV and say all this. Mm-hmm. And give, if you are to believe what happened and take that face value, to give a reasoned, sound, believable, if you want, account of what happened. Compassionate. It is the perfect PR. You could not dream of a better scenario.
I can't even think of a commentator who would be better than Darren at doing this. Right? This is cultural capital. In addition to the financial capital that Jannik has given his position, he has this cultural capital because of who he's chosen to be on his team.
If Stefano Vukov were his coach, how would that have played out? We'll get to him later on. But you know what I mean? Like if you have a coach that people don't trust for whatever reason, if you have a coach that isn't necessarily able to communicate in English as incredibly well as Darren is, how different would this be? It is just the perfect scenario for Jannik in this situation.
The other question is the comparisons to other famous cases in tennis. Are they similar? Is it fair to make comparisons? And firstly, I don't blame people for making parallels to other famous doping cases. I think you have to be cautious, of course. I mentioned earlier that the Sinner team actually used the Sharapova case as precedent setting in their case, and the tribunal accepted it, saying that the Sharapova case has created this precedent where as long as the player discharges their duty of caution, of utmost caution, the player can be sometimes excused for mistakes that their team makes. And that was Maria's argument at the time, that she was cautious but her team was not. Like, she had delegated these responsibilities to people who were on paper extremely qualified to do those jobs. And they accepted that in the case of Sinner, and as was announced today, Sinner has actually fired Ferrara and Naldi from the team. Obviously, you have to. I understand why he kept them during the case, but at this point, clearly you have to part ways.
You can't keep them. If you are to try and bolster or maintain, hang on to your integrity or perceived integrity, you've got to let them go.
Right.
Because the quote-unquote Italian context here, this has happened so many times with Italian athletes. So much so that the drug, in the form that it's sold, has the big doping warning on it.
Right.
You cannot be, and what, the guy who purchased it has a pharmacology degree? Mm-hmm. How, with a pharmacology degree, and with this being so widespread in Italian sport, something that's known across all levels of sport, be it from professional to junior athletes, junior tennis players, professional tennis players, all different types of sport. This is known. This is a known thing. Mm-hmm. How do you then have that product in the team setup and still be allowed to keep that position? It's untenable.
Right.
But also, it is a very fair question to ask. How, given all that, should we give Sinner and the team a pass here, essentially, when this is not unforeseen by any stretch?
Right.
This becomes a matter of technicalities that we're dealing with here. Because there was gross negligence. It's a matter of who is being made to bear that responsibility.
Exactly. You can choose to believe the story or not. Again, I don't feel qualified to even judge the story based on its merits. If you believe the story at face value, then the team was extremely negligent in even having the product anywhere near the player. It could also be a very convenient story, right? If you've been suspended, you've tested positive for this thing that a lot of athletes across different sports have experienced before, you got a story really quick. This is confirmation bias, right? The way people interpret this. Is it convenient that the team was able to come up with a story that quickly? Or was it convenient because it was the truth? I don't know.
You look at the uses of this drug, and it's, in some cases, for muscle mass building, muscle development, and you look at Sinner and you're like, well, that checks out. That's why he'd use it. And this is not to body shame him, but if you're looking at it like you were saying, what am I inclined to believe? What are the confirmation biases? Mm-hmm. That's something you look at and you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Is it a masking agent, as some suggest it can be used as? Like it was in the 80s with the German Sporting mm-hmm. Federation? Mm-hmm. That's something that's harder to prove.
Right. And we don't know, right? We don't know if it can be used like that. There are some anti-doping insiders who think maybe people are using this to distract from a more serious substance. Or maybe they're using it because testosterone creams are more expensive.
Mm-hmm. This is over-the-counter.
Right.
You can be as cheap as €12 for, a canister or
right.
a cream.
And maybe they're rolling the dice because they metabolize so quickly that a lot of times it will be undetectable.
The last thing I'll say about this, the PTPA and the ATP Council, specifically the PTPA, has had a lot to say about what their aims and goals are when stuff like this happen. With the Simona case, with this case, they're saying they're out here fighting for fairness, what have you, blah, blah, blah. The very first thing you should be doing, if your players are contending that the entire system is
rigor mortis.
It's rigged, fraudulent. It is so against the players. It is just calamitous. Then you need to have a fund to have players be the number 1 or the 250, be able to access to defend themselves. That is base level stuff. Like, if your players are out here crying wolf about how this is so inequitable, that the rules don't apply to everybody, well, the reason they don't apply to everybody is because you need the means to be able to have a positive outcome. And the majority of tennis players don't. So provide the means.
So act like
what
a real union.
Act like what you should be doing instead of the bluster and the talk, and provide funds for players to then defend themselves. That's what I want to see.
Act like a union. Bill Ackman can afford a little fund for Tara Moore and other players of her level.
If you were tuning into this segment hoping that we'd come down, drop the hammer on Jannik, that we would say guilty, shame, shame, shame. That's not what that's clearly not what has happened. It's not what we think. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other on guilt or innocence.
No. What I have a strong opinion on is I feel like even though the system functioned as it was supposed to, I feel like they failed on the public-facing side of this. The fact that this happened 5 months ago to the top player in the world, and we didn't hear a whisper about it until now, until it was fully resolved. Yes, it was within the rules that they've set out. That doesn't mean that I have to think it's fair or transparent.
Fair to whom?
Fair to the system in general. If they say after a provisional suspension, we have the right to publicize this, why wouldn't you?
There was a caveat, right? The caveat.
Of course there was a caveat. But tennis has a history, like many sports, of silent bans. People already don't trust the system. So why would you play with that trust even further, which I feel is what happened here.
So you think that once this happened, it should have been public knowledge, period?
Yes.
Regardless of the appeals to this, to that?
I do. And I do understand the pitfalls to that.
I think that's a road we can go down, provided everybody who is facing this scenario is able to defend themselves the same way.
Fair enough. And my last general kind of anti-doping opinion is that any athlete is capable of doping. Any athlete is capable of cheating. If any of my faves ever tested positive, I would be heartbroken, but I would not be surprised.
I mean, at this point, would I be heartbroken if I had gotten a tattoo? Maybe. But, like, it's not...
These bonds are able to break.
Exactly. Thanks for the memories. You know?
All right, U.S. Open preview.
This is what, our, 38th draw preview or something? And can we please finally do what we say we want to do, which is be more meta and less micro with this stuff?
Fine.
Because ultimately, as we've been proven so many times, it doesn't matter. The fine details don't matter. The draws implode. Let's look at cute early round matchups. Let's look at who are the big overriding figures in this draw. What are the stories, the narratives to look for? That kind of thing.
Okay.
Less of the ifs. If right. It doesn't exist.
If doesn't exist. Let's talk about a quartet of first round matchups on the women's side that has been talked about extensively already. We've got Andreescu Paulini. They're going to meet for the third time in 3 straight majors. Paulini won, obviously, in Roland Garros and Wimbledon, both in the third round. Now they're going to meet in the first round. Andreescu, I recently watched in Toronto, losing to Tsurenko in the third set. It doesn't give me a lot of hope that she will beat Paulini here.
Zhang Qinwen and Amanda Anisimova in the first round. Horrendous luck for both women. When you consider that they're both coming in on a high, Qinwen having won the Olympic gold medal, Anisimova making the final in Toronto. Just tough all around in that one. Jelena Ostapenko and Naomi Osaka in the first round. That's wild.
Naomi has said that she was sort of revving up her whole season to peak at the US Open. Jelena Ostapenko has won only one match across Toronto and Cincinnati. Seems like her form has really dipped lately. I do not know what to expect from this matchup. I believe OsakaPenko reached the quarterfinals last year and lost to Coco Gauff. And then finally, Sofia Kenin and Emma Raducanu. A former Australian Open champ, a former US Open champ, both of whom have seen better days. That'll be interesting.
Of course, Iga Swiatek is the top seed. I would say not the favorite, though. Like you said earlier in the show, Aryna Sabalenka must be the favorite at this tournament, I think. Coco Gauff, the defending champion, she hasn't had a great string of results in recent months. Jelena Rybakina, the other hardcourt big name. There is a whole lot of chaos going on there because she just announced the split with her coach of 5 years, Vukov.
Yes, great news. I love good news, as Kamala Harris said. To me, the split with Vukov can only be seen as good news at this point. Rybakina has won a ton of matches this year. She's won, it was in Brisbane, right, where she beat Sabalenka, then lost at the Australian Open, won Abu Dhabi. Like, she has the ability to win this tournament. She does not have a great record in this stretch of the season through Canada, Cincinnati, and New York.
The top half of the women's draw, of course, headlined by Iga and Rybakina. Those are the top 2 seeds in the top half. By seeding, the quarterfinals would be Swiatek against Pegula and Rybakina against Paolini. This is Paolini coming into a 3rd consecutive major where people will be overlooking her at your peril at this point after having made the final in both Paris and London.
A few things to call out here. Andreeva and Swiatek could play each other in the round of 16. Andreeva just took Iga to a 7-5 third set in Cincinnati. That is a really interesting matchup if it happens. Danielle Collins, her form has slipped a little bit. It seems that Iga may have cursed her after the...
There's the injury concern.
There is. She could play Diana Schneider in the 3rd round, but Schneider would have to get through either Schmiedlova or Tauson. Schmiedlova, the first runner-up to the bronze medal at the Olympics, one of the semifinalists at the Olympics.
Should the 3rd in line not be able to serve?
So, Schneider has won 3 titles this year, has really come up. She has not performed exceedingly well at the majors, but this is a chance. Jessica Pegula has really turned her season around after injury, won Toronto, reached the final in Cincinnati, and for all that, could face Iga in the quarters.
Well, she opens against Shelby Rogers, who will be playing her final professional tournament. She's retiring after this US Open. That section has a lot of interesting names. There's Samsonova as well. Andreeva could play Samsonova in the 3rd round. Swiatek could play Pavlyuchenkova in the 3rd round. Colin Schneider, Bolter, Pegula. This is a challenging little section of the draw.
This is not easy.
2nd quarter, that's Rybakina Paolini. That's where you have Ostapenko opening against Osaka. The winner of that match likely to play Muchova.
A semi-finalist last year.
Can you imagine? A 2nd round match. Naomi, if she gets by Ostapenko, to then have to maybe play Muchova, that's a very tough start.
And then, as a reward, have to grind it out against Leylah Fernandez, perhaps? And then maybe...
Putintseva.
It's very, very tough if you're Naomi, but if you're somebody else, you can look at it like, well, Ostapenko, Osaka, Muchova, only one of them is going to get through, and they may be battle-weary by the time they get to you.
Yeah, to get to either Yulia or Jasmine in the 4th round, and what happens there.
Right.
The bottom half of the draw, that's where we have Aryna Sabalenka and Coco Gauff. In the 3rd quarter, Coco opens against Gracheva. She's going to play 2nd on Ash on the 1st day session.
This draw is not too bad for Coco.
For me, this is the 2nd most open section of the draw.
Aside from 2nd quarter?
Aside from 4th quarter.
But Sabalenka is anchoring that one.
To get to the quarterfinal.
Okay.
There.
Coco might face Svitolina in the 3rd. Could be challenging. Emma Navarro in the 4th. And then the quarterfinal sets up a Goff, perhaps Barbie K quarterfinal, a Paula Badosa. She just won Washington, D.C. I think she has a really good chance to reach the quarters.
Would she make the semis in Cincinnati or something like that? She had another deep run recently. She's clearly back. Badosa's back has allowed her to be back. This section, Babs, Taylor Townsend, who opens against Trevisan.
Not Trevisan.
Certainly not my favorite. Badosa, Vika, Sloan, Sakari, Navarro, Kostyuk, Svitolina, Goff. Make a case for any of them. You could make a case for any of them.
Right.
And I guess why I think it's wide open is that so many of these players you could see losing in their first match or second match. Not that they would. I'm just saying if they lose early, it's like, okay. Except for maybe Svitolina. Svitolina has proven that she is still that consistency queen.
Yeah.
In the final quarter, that's where we have number 2, Sabalenka, and number 7, Zhang Qinwen. Of course, we said Qinwen opens against Anisimova. Madison Keys, who had a recent injury scare, having to retire in her last match. She's back. She's opening against Siniakova. Of course, Grand Dame queen on the doubles court, but also resurgent in singles this year. Just missing out on being seeded.
Yeah, Siniakova, as we speak, is currently playing a semifinal in Cleveland against Haddad Maia. Madison reached the semifinals last year, played absolutely lights out for half of that match against Sabalenka. Has she looked at the draw? Does she know if she gets through this tough first round, she could play Sabalenka in the fourth round? Again?
Kasatkina there, has had a lean stretch of results. Recently, Donna Vekic, who's had a lean stretch of results. Did I misspeak?
But she was in the Charleston final. I know that was a while ago.
Oh my God.
Abu Dhabi final? Anyone?
Vekic.
That's hardcore.
Olympic runner-up.
Vekic has been so close several times this summer.
And has looked on death's door in so many of these matches.
Which is really just her thing.
I was at work the other day and the TV isn't even always on in the bar. And it happened to be mid-afternoon, early evening, and somebody had turned on the TV and tennis was on. And what do I see? Donna Vekic in a medical timeout, looking like she's about to collapse on court. Again.
That's so rude. But true. Semi-finalist at Wimbledon. Silver medalist at the Olympics. She could play her gold medal match opponent in the fourth round. This is also the site of Zhang's big breakout, her first major quarterfinal last year. Then she was the runner-up at the Australian Open. These courts are great for her.
By quarterfinal, this half, Babs against Coco Gauff, Qinwen against Sabalenka. I'm making 0 predictions as to who's going to win. Do with this as you must.
As far as larger narratives, I see a defending champion who is not coming in with the mojo they did last year. I see a number 2 player in Aryna Sabalenka who is a hard-court queen, especially faster surfaces. Iga Świątek, who never really does that well on this summer North American swing, but perhaps enters with more confidence than she did last year.
Still a prior champion at this event.
I know, right? The fact that Iga is so successful that we just sort of gloss over her U.S. Open win.
We have up-and-coming players who could be ready to break out. Emma Navarro, Qinwen. That's it, I guess.
No.
From
this
half.
The open question is,
Mira Andreeva.
Is Mira Andreeva ready to make that big step in a major?
Deanna Schneider. What's Rybakina's headspace like? Mm-hmm. What's her physical situation like? What's her emotional state like? There are a lot of questions surrounding her going into this tournament. On the men's side, Jannik Sinner, number 1 seed. Novak Djokovic, number 2. Number 3 seed at this tournament on the men's side is Carlos Alcaraz. Number 4 seed, that guy.
Sinner, Medvedev, and Alcaraz have all landed in the same half. Sinner and Medvedev are in the same quarter. Daniil won the U.S. Open in 2021. This is tough. Novak reportedly is dealing with some physical issues again, if you believe the reporting about his practice today. No idea, right? We've heard this before. It would make sense if the knee was still acting up, but he was lucky to dodge Carlos and Medvedev earlier.
Opens against Radu Albat, a second round against Gera or Struff, potentially Popperin in the third round, then either Shelton or Tiafoe, likely in the fourth, Rublev Lehechka in the quarterfinals. Truly the best quarterfinal option of any player. Rublev has never made a slam semifinal. It is as good as Novak could have hoped for, truly. Opening round, Ben Shelton against Dominic Thiem. That's going to be first up on Ash on Monday in the day session. And then at the top of that draw, Gael Monfils opening against Diego Schwartzman. Schwartzman, who playing in his final US Open, made it through qualifying. Feel-good stories on the men's side coming into this tournament. Unfortunately, Gael may also be playing his last US Open and they have to open against each other.
Has he referenced that at all?
He has not, but he's been very cryptic on Twitter, interacting with haters, telling him about how he's playing like shit, and he's like, yeah, man, it's true. I'm really contemplating if I need to be continuing and doing it, like answering earnestly to these bad faith actors on the internet while reflecting on the state of his career.
Well, he's coming off a victory over Carlos Alcaraz, so he may be feeling himself a little bit.
I'm just saying, if that's on an outer court in the first round, get there and watch it.
Yeah. Bouncing back to Shelton and Thiem for a moment, Dominic Thiem finally got a wild card to a big tournament. And
former champion.
A former champion in 2020. He averted disaster. This will be his last US Open. He will most likely lose to Shelton, but, this assures him a good court placement. And I feel like that's all he could really hope for at this point. And I'm glad. I think as a former champ, he deserves, as much as no one deserves anything in sports, I feel like he deserves that.
Because remember, the poors didn't deserve handout during COVID.
Yes. You will never let him forget.
Casper Ruud is the number 8 seed in this draw. It's looking very tough for me to think of Ruud as going far in this tournament.
Oh, are we doing the bottom half first?
Oh, I guess I'm
okay. That's fine.
All over the place here. Yeah, so we're looking at the bottom half here, where the quarterfinals would be Ruud against that guy and Rublev against Djokovic. That's by seed. We mentioned that Thiem opens against Shelton. You mentioned earlier in the show that we could have a rematch of Shelton and Tiafoe, this time again in the third round. There isn't a whole lot of minefields in this bottom half. It's just a lot of good to very good players who might have to play each other, which is how it should play out.
Right. We have remember Dominic Stricker, who beat Tsitsipas last year. He's there in Ruud and Fritz's little section of the draw. Berrettini and Fritz could potentially play each other in the second round. Runa and Nakashima is an upset alert, I would say. It's not a guaranteed upset, but Brandon Nakashima has recent wins over Fritz, Tommy Paul, Shapovalov, Artur Fils, just in the last few weeks.
This is a tournament where most of the big names have had a big result here in the past. Sinner would be looking to better his career best quarterfinal showing in 2022. Rublev, about as safe of a bet to make the quarterfinals at this tournament, having done so in 2017, 20, 22, 23, but as you mentioned, never making a slam semifinal to date. Tsitsipas has never been past the third round here, nor has Holger Rune, which not that crazy, he's still a youngin'. But also...
Yeah, but Stefanos?
Yeah, I agree, wow. But also Urkac, a 5-time second rounder at this tournament. That's wild to me.
That is really wild. All that to say, if you're that guy, you're probably feeling pretty good about your draw. The minefields are, well, maybe Pericard, Cerundolo in the third round, Holger Rune, there's no guarantee he makes it. I mean, Nishioka just won somewhere. Atlanta? Yeah, Atlanta. Musetti, Taylor Fritz. Again, Taylor Fritz is probably a good bet to reach the quarterfinals or round of 16, and then that's that.
In the top half, that's where Sinner is, naturally. Sinner and Alcaraz are the two top seeds in this half. By seed, Sinner would play Medvedev in the quarters, and Alcaraz would play By seed, Alcaraz would play Urkac in the quarterfinals.
All right.
This is where we have more first round matches of intrigue, I think.
Yeah, I think, Tsitsipas Kokkinakis. We already know that Tsitsipas has some problems at this tournament. Lost in the second round last year. Kokkinakis is the type of player who is going to want to put on a show. Is going to drag you around for a few hours.
Archie Fils opens against Lerner Tien, the young American, up-and-coming American. Just recently won his first few professional matches, I believe. One to watch, as was Fils last year at the US Open. So this is a nice little turn of events. Tommy Paul against Lorenzo Sonego. Jack Draper opens against Zhang Zhizhen. And Alex de Minaur against Marcos Giron.
A second round that's interesting, potentially, is Carlos versus Dennis. Dennis is a chaos agent. So if Carlos is not feeling himself that day, buckle up.
And then potentially Alcaraz against Draper, another lefty in the third round.
Sebastian Corda just won the title in Washington. He could be Carlos's fourth round opponent. I think the path is still clear here for Carlos to reach the semifinal. What happens in the semifinal is anyone's guess. Jannik is in great form, as we saw in Cincinnati. He maybe is still dealing with a hip injury. Is he also dealing with a little bit of emotional exhaustion from this stuff? He's going to be asked about this constantly. Is that going to be a factor at all?
I mean, he'll be asked about it once. He'll be compelled to talk about it once, and then we'll see the playbook. I've talked about this. I'm no longer answering questions about that. That's what's going to happen.
Today, of course, he was asked about it quite a bit, and apparently the US Open moderator in press tried to stop the question, say, no more follow-ups about this. We're going to talk about tennis. And the follow-ups continued, and Jannik continued to answer them. Which, good. But, excuse me.
No, there's an agent at play there. That's Jill Smoller behind the scenes. That's what that is.
But really, tennis journalism has a bad enough reputation as it is. This is what they have to fight against.
Mm-hmm. If Tsitsipas is to get by the third round for the first time at this tournament in his career, he may have to go through Felix Auger-Aliassime in the third round. So, it'll be an achievement for him.
Yeah, I don't even know if he gets out of the first round, to be totally honest.
You're very invested in that upset, aren't you?
Not invested, just, I don't know, I believe it. Mm-hmm. I don't even like Kokkinakis.
I disagree with you about Alcaraz having a decent draw to the semifinal. I think if he gets there, he'll be heavily tested. Draper is a tough out if he's not wilting under the sun.
Yeah, and so is Corda.
Yeah, it's by the time he gets to the quarterfinal or the semis, if he's in good physical shape, it might be for the best to then have to deal with Sinner in the semifinals.
Right. No, I don't mean to imply that it will be easy, but I still see Carlos getting through to the semi. The other thing is, somebody in the mailbag asked which North American players do you see going far in the US Open, and my first pick was Tommy Paul. Mm-hmm. However, he would have to get by Jannik Sinner in the fourth round. I'm not sure I see that happening now.
Well, isn't it easy for you to make that claim now
without
that the draw has come out? That question was asked prior to the draw.
And I said Tommy Paul.
I don't think we answered that on the show.
No, but I wrote it down. I literally wrote it down. But what I'm saying is I'm probably wrong now because he would have to beat Sinner.
It might have been helpful in answering that question if you had seen the draw before making that pick.
The narratives here, Djokovic just got kind of the cherry on top of his career. The last thing that he was really fighting for was the Olympic gold medal. We've seen him and other players kind of dip after they got that, that crowning achievement that they were really fighting for. And he's dealing with an injury.
Well, he has the goal of 25 now. There's always going to be another goal.
I know.
Should he want it.
But he even admitted that he was sort of struggling with motivation a little bit this year, and I think it was pretty obvious through most of the season. Mm-hmm. So I think it'll be interesting, where does Novak's career go from here? And how long does he want to put in? If he's still competing at the top of the game, I think he'll play as long as possible. But I don't know.
I'd like to see a young player bust out in a big way at this tournament. That's what I'd like to see. Somebody new that's not any of those guys. Pick your poison. All right, that brings us to the end of our US Open preview. You were worried that the Sinner drug stuff went on too long?
Rarely does the story get queued up like this right before a major. Personally, I'd rather talk about that than the draws.
It's easily one of our least favorite episodes to record every year. So the timing of this story could not have been better.
Every year, every quarter. These
Sure,
things
the
happen all the
4 times
time.
that we do every year, you know what I mean. I hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find me on Twitter at tennis_John. I'm Jonathan.
I'm James at ElliotJMR.
2 L's, 2 T's. Everything Body Serve related can be found at linktree.com/thebodyserve. Thanks for listening.
Till next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.